Hey everyone, and a happy new year. Welcome to the Hear Me Roar podcast with Katherine Itacy. I am your host, Katherine Itacy, and I will be doing another solo episode today about writing. And so I've had a lot of people ask me since I've recently finished writing my memoir about the writing process, about the publishing process, about trying to get representation. So I figured I'd spend this episode just sharing some insights that I've learned over the last year as to the process and what's worked for me and what hasn't. So before we get into it, I want to thank everyone for staying patient with me through my hiatus. The end of 2018 was kind of a whirlwind. I had a pretty bad fall in November where I twisted my foot while walking down some stairs. Thanks to my neurological deficits. So right on top of that came Thanksgiving, followed immediately by over a 3-week cruise with my mom. Shout out to Mary Alice Johnston, to Indonesia and Australia, which was amazing. Followed within hours by my birthday, then Christmas, and then moving to Detroit. So I am reaching out to you today from Detroit, where I'll be situated for the foreseeable future. So I'm happy to be in my new location, but it's going to take a bit before I get settled, get acclimated, and get back into having some co-hosts and special guests. So I'm really excited that I get to start the year off fresh and get cracking with some hopefully really great podcast episodes. So, like I said, thanks again for your patience with the hiatus, and thanks again to Angie from Angelina Rose Photography for doing the last episode with me about female business owners. We got some great responses from that episode. So, obviously, I just want to put a disclaimer out there. I'm not making myself out to be some sort of master or expert in writing, in book writing. This was my first experience this past year. This is no masterclass, which BT dubs, shout out to masterclass. They've got some incredible sessions out there on writing. I signed up just a few weeks ago to be, a student, if you would call it. And you get access to, hearing lessons on writing from James Patterson and Malcolm Gladwell. There's sessions, I think, on playing basketball by Steph Curry. It's just a pretty fascinating website if you are a perpetual learner, as I am, and I know a lot of you are, and you want to continue learning things about the world, but aren't necessarily looking to get into an actual class, like a college class. So I would absolutely plug them. Clearly, they're not a sponsor, but I've found them to be a great source of knowledge and resource. So I know I'm a brand new author, and my book is still currently being considered for representation. But like I said, I've had some people ask me about the journey that I've been on, and I had a very good friend of mine suggest that I document my journey throughout this book writing process. So I figured I would do that orally in this podcast episode. So the first part of it is going to be about the actual writing, and the second part will be about efforts to get your book out there, get it published. So I just wanted to share what my experience has been this past year. So for those of you who know, I decided to do a memoir based off my experience the last 30 years of going from spinal surgery to spinal surgery, and everything that I've done and everything that's happened to me within that time period and the lessons that I've learned. So the tentative title is From National Champion to Physically Disabled Activist. And it really goes through right from childhood of getting diabetes at age 4, learning to grow up and take on responsibilities at that young age, learning how to feel quote unquote normal when you have a huge lump on your back and this autoimmune disease, having to carry needles and vials around with you to sleepovers and, having to carry candy around and not let others, take it because they think it's just for enjoyment, because it's technically my medicine. So all those sorts of things, gaining confidence, then getting into track, pursuing elite athletics, and then having my body kind of disrupt my Olympic dreams. So then going into law school, my practice with criminal defense, and then becoming disabled. So it really runs the gamut of the lessons that I've learned throughout my life. And I thought it was really important, since I am no longer able to contribute in the capacity that I used to with nonprofits and with my criminal defense practice, or even working with the federal defenders, that I could write down my experiences. So for me, when I started the journey in the late summer of 2017 of beginning to write the book, I did a lot of research from getting books from the library and learning, how these things are structured, how the book writing process goes about of submitting it to get published, literary agents. I knew nothing of it. I knew nothing of commercial writing. I only knew about really my experiences with writing legal documents. So the one thing that I really had to do, first of all, is kind of like turn my brain off from the legalese and writing so very formally to writing as if I'm having a conversation, really as if I'm doing this podcast episode, and trying to communicate in the way that's natural for me, which is not using a bunch of, big stuffy words, but really communicating with the passion and excitement that I feel, or the anger and frustration that I sometimes feel, with my body and with, things that have happened throughout my life. So it was quite a process to kind of, you need to understand your audience. So for me, with legal writing, obviously my audience were opposing counsel, prosecutors, and judges. And so they are quite a different breed of what they're expecting in terms of the format of the writing and the words used, whereas I wanted to speak to a much broader audience, and so I needed to change the tone of my language and my writing. So that was the first thing that I really looked at. And then the second thing that I did, and I've seen like some of the more famous writers talk about it a little bit, this kind of contrast between doing an outline, doing like a formal outline of, chapter 1's going to be this, chapter 2 is going to be that, versus what I ended up doing, which was what I called lovingly a brain dump. So what I wanted to do was kind of spew out onto paper or onto my computer everything that I could think that I wanted to communicate in this memoir. What lessons that I had learned, things that had happened to me, etc. I wanted to get it all out so that I knew that all of the things that I wanted to mention were there. And then I did a lot of revising and reorganizing, restructuring. And later on, I worked with a copy editor to do a little bit more of that restructuring. The downside to doing a brain dump is obviously the disorganization. So you aren't really getting your thoughts gathered. You aren't really figuring out how it's going to look like in an end product. And there were many instances where I repeated something that had happened in numerous chapters. So if I were you, especially if you're not doing a memoir, if you're doing some other form of nonfiction or biography, or any kind of novel, I would absolutely strongly encourage you to do an outline first. This book that I had recently read suggested writing from number 1 to number 21, things you want to write, and from the very first thing you want to talk about to the very last thing you want to talk about, and then writing down, I guess, the other 19 things that you think should make up your book. So I thought that was very helpful. Another suggests putting them on index cards so that you can restructure, which I actually also did, not only with the content of my book, but with titles for chapters. I actually use them as lesson numbers and not chapter numbers, so it was really figuring out how I wanted to structure that and whether I wanted to do it chronologically or do it based on subject matter. So again, I think doing the brain dump, it was what I needed to do because there was so much that was in there in my brain kind of rattling around, and I couldn't see the structure to it yet. I couldn't really see the final form and know how I was going to present it to the world. But if you're doing something else, more of a storytelling, I would strongly suggest trying to do an outline first so that things aren't getting doubled up and misorganized, and it saves you a lot of work in the end, which I'm trying to do now as I work on a crime novel, which I'm pretty excited about for you guys to hear about. But again, this is the big thing that I learned about the initial process. So another thing that really helps is that I brought a notebook or piece of paper or, even my phone with the notes section or my laptop or a desktop. I used all formats whenever I could. I used Google Docs, any place that you can use to write down thoughts, because as I recently read in a novel writing book, it rang so true to me. A lot of times your thoughts, your new ideas or thoughts about what to contribute in the book are going to come when you're either in the shower or trying to get to sleep. So it's really helpful if you have something nearby to document your thoughts so that you don't lose them later on. In terms of writer's block, so I am not ashamed to say that I am intimately familiar with writer's block. It used to hit me all the time when I would have to write appellate briefs in my law practice and at the federal defenders, and obviously many times before that as a student. Especially when there's a deadline approaching, I think that is when writer's block certainly seems to be looming. So I get it. I've totally been there, and I get how frustrating it is. For me, with writing the memoir, and even with writing this novel now, I really, since I'm disabled, and a lot of my days I don't have the energy or the consciousness to do much work on it, I am not so stressed about the writer's block. So if something's not hitting me, if I really don't feel like writing, I'll read. And another great pointer out there is to read a lot of the genre that you want to write in. So obviously, preceding the whole writer's block and an outline versus brain dump, you really have to start off by figuring out what genre of work that you want to produce, because that's really going to matter not only for how you structure your piece, but also for how you go about submitting it. So in terms of figuring out if you're not familiar with it, and I was obviously familiar with memoirs, but I hadn't read all that many. I spent the last year and a half, 2 years really, reading a lot of memoirs, a lot of them. And so you get a flavor for how they're structured and what the content is and the tone of voice and whether humor is used and a lot of great ideas as to how to convey your stories. And for me, obviously, it's since mine is almost like a memoir / self-help, I also read a few of those to figure out how I really should, how I should organize and structure my piece. So when you have writer's block, if you're really trying to do it and you have a limited time schedule, I know obviously most of you out there are also working at the same time or have families, children, spouses, things to do, a lot of things to do with your time, and you might not have that much free time to do your writing. Whenever I had time restraints, what I would usually do is, if I really couldn't stand to look at one particular piece of unfinished writing, I would switch gears and work on a different case. So that if I was I had spent so much time writing about one case and one particular subject of law, then I would kind of give my brain a little time to let that sink in, let that kind of go away a little bit, and focus on something new so that your brain kind of gets a break. Now, obviously, when you're writing a piece of literature, you are not necessarily writing different things. But what I would do also is, if I was sick of writing, then I would start reading more case law, or I would start reviewing the trial transcripts and the case file. So there are things that you can do if you're not in a particularly creative mood or feel like writing. Perhaps you could read another book that's based on your genre that you're interested in, or you can read a book about writing. So for me, with this new novel, I actually got so inspired and filled up at least 20, 30 pages of notes just based on a book that was talking about how to write a novel. So it wasn't even the content matter, but it was really about the way it should be structured, or how you should describe a scene and a character and subplots that really got me inspired. So I would suggest that if you have writer's block, I've always felt that pushing through it produces some of the worst writing. And especially if you're doing creative writing, you really don't want something to feel forced. So I would suggest trying to switch gears if you could. And so this also kind of touches upon the revisions and editing portion. And I know a lot of other authors suggest this as well. Whenever you find yourself kind of annoyed with the writing process or with your project, and especially at the end of your writing, when you feel like you've done a final draft, do not look at it for at least a couple weeks. You need to come back to it with fresh eyes. And once you're so immersed in a piece, it's going to be hard for you to be objective at all. I know for me, when I'm doing writing, I know what I want to convey, and I know what I meant to say. So inadvertently and subconsciously, when I'm reviewing it, I'll kind of fill that in. My brain will fill in the things that might be missing. And then when someone else reads it and they have no familiarity with the piece, they have no idea what I'm talking about. So it really, really helps to give yourself some space and some distance from your writing before you go into any kind of revision or editing process. My biggest problem with editing my own work, like I said, is that I know what I'm trying to say. So I actually enlisted the help of my poor friends and family. I had several close friends and even my mom, and thanks again, Mom, read either pieces of my memoir for me. My mom actually read one of its earliest versions, and they gave me feedback. And, I have to say, everyone that I reached out to, who were of all different backgrounds, all different ages, ethnic and racial groups, everything, I wanted different readers to look at it, because that's your ideal audience, is a wide group of people. And so you want to get feedback about your work from all different kinds of people. And so it is a little hard when you're trying to enlist friends and family, because you have to factor in some biases that they're really probably not going to be that upfront and tell you if it's really horrible, because they are probably want to protect your feelings. But in terms of substantive suggestions for changing things or restructuring or reordering, I found the small group of people that I reached out to incredibly helpful. And so once I was done getting their feedback, implementing my own edits, and then taking some time to kind of get a break from it, I took my best edit. And like I said, I submitted it to a copy editor who I was connected to by a friend of mine. And over the course of a few months, she went through and did an incredibly professional, objective editing of my entire work. And really gave me more objective and honest and removed feedback on the piece. And obviously, because she is a professional and has an advanced degree in writing, she knew more of the technical stuff. So for me, being that I was a legal research and writing specialist at the Federal Defenders and then doing a lot of appellate work back at my firm, I did have a lot of, training and experience, relatively speaking, for writing. So I know not everyone has that. And even though, as I mentioned earlier, that the legal way of writing is a lot different than writing in a creative sense, the actual technical rules I was a little bit more familiar with than some of you might be. You might have a completely different profession, which is not to say that you can't write. It just means that you might need to rely more upon a professional, and it might be more helpful. So this kind of segues into submitting your work. Everything out there says once you're done with your piece and you want to get it published, that the best bet that you have is to go through a literary agent. So you first need to submit either your first chapter or your first 3 chapters or your first 50 pages to a particular literary agent who is interested in receiving submissions about your genre. So the thing that I learned, the biggest thing, is that most publishers, especially the larger ones, will not accept unsolicited manuscripts. So if you are unrepresented, if you do not have a literary agent, then they're not going to even consider your work. So while there are other avenues, there are smaller publishing houses that do not need to go through a literary agent. And there's also the method of self-publishing. If you do want to go through to larger publishing houses, you need to try and get representation through a literary agent. So how do you go about doing that? Well, here's what I've learned. The first thing you need to do, like I had mentioned earlier, is trying to do some research on the whole thing. I had absolutely no idea how to submit it, where to submit it to, what format, what the letter should look like. I knew nothing. So I went to my beloved Warwick Public Library, which I miss very, very much. And I went and got a bunch of books on trying to publish. There are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of books that are trying to make it every year. There are thousands of books that are published every year. So there's a lot of people interested in writing. And, that saying of everyone having, one great novel in us. Well, obviously there's a lot of publishers who know that. And so they have a lot of manuals that are very helpful to get you more intimately familiar with the process. So the one big resource that I used it's called Writer's Market. And so they have a reference guide that's available probably at every local library, if not an affiliated library close by to you. And each year they list every agent that is looking for every different genre of book. They have their contact information, like I said, what genres they're looking for, what their specific submission requirements would be. And they have an online version of Writer's Market which you do have to pay for, but it will update you if a certain agent has changed their requirements or changed what they're looking for. So I use them, and I actually went through for hours at a time, went through the latest guide and looked for every single literary agent that was interested in memoirs. And so the next thing I did was writing down their contact information, their website. I created a spreadsheet and I listed a good 140 different literary agencies that are interested in that genre. Well, then what you have to do is you have to go to their website and check out which specific agent might be interested, because not every agent's going to be open to that genre within that agency. And each agent might have different requirements for how you submit something to them. Agents get thousands and thousands of what they call query letters each year. And so they are very quickly skimming what you submit to them. And if you have one typo, if you have one error in there, if you have not done your job and checked the specific requirements that they're looking for, they're probably not going to even give you a second thought and either click delete or throw it in the trash or hopefully the recycling or the shredder or whatever they do. So it's your job to do the research beforehand. You want to look like a professional. And even if your book is completely satirical or, has a bunch of lewd conduct or swearing in it and it's very informal in format, you do not want your query letter and your contact to that agent to be that informal, because that's seen as unprofessional. So you have to look at the guidelines for what to put in a query letter, whom to address it to, which email address. Sometimes you send it directly to that particular agent. Sometimes you send it to submissions at whatever the agency is.com. And sometimes you submit it through an online website that is called Submittable. There's another one. There's many, but that keep all of your pieces of writing or your submission materials so that you don't have to keep redoing it for every agent. But whatever it is, you have to check and do your homework first. The other thing to note is that most literary agencies do not want you pitching to more than one agent at a time within that same agency. A lot of them are fine if you're submitting it to other agencies, but not other agents within their agency, because I'm sure it'd be pretty upsetting if two different agents arrived at the same pitch meeting, ready to tell their colleagues about a book they're considering representing, only for the group to learn that another colleague had wasted his or her own valuable time drafting the same pitch. So bottom line is, be professional, and you don't want to piss anyone in the publishing world off. You want to have good relationships with them and remain professional and considerate, because even if, and you will inevitably get rejection letters. James Patterson was saying his first book wasn't even sold, but then the second book that got sold, something like 34 different agents rejected him before he got an acceptance letter. So it's really about persistence. But that being said, if you are pissed off at an agent and become unprofessional with them because they rejected you, the next time you want to pitch something to them, they're clearly not going to give you much consideration. So be professional, be very clear in what they require, and understand the time restraints. So most of them will let you know that it's going to take 6 to 8 weeks for them to consider it. And if you don't hear anything back, it's consider it to be a rejection. Some will tell you in a follow-up email, thanks, I'll be looking at it. If you don't hear from me within 8 weeks, then feel free to reach out. But don't keep harping on them, especially in this electronic age where it's so easy to contact them either through Twitter or Instagram or email. You don't want to hound them because it's certainly not going to do you any good. And so I'm in the process of trying to seek representation from a literary agent. So what they would do is they contact publishing houses that they have relationships with and some that they don't, and they will try and then pitch your work to the publishing house. And so if a publisher wants to buy your book, then they will work out the contract as to how they're going to publish it, and if you get an advance or you get residuals or whatever the case is. Usually literary agents get about 15% of the profit. It's different sometimes for foreign sales. If your book gets published outside of the U.S., it might be a little bit higher at that point, but usually, usually the agents are about 15%. The other mode, obviously, like I talked about, besides going to smaller publishing houses directly and pitching them by submitting your work to them, is to do self-publishing. And a lot of that can be done through Amazon, through Kindle. You have to know what the format needs to be for publishing, because electronic ebooks, are going to be different format than, say, a printed copy. And if you're going through a print company to get your hard books, your actual physical books, you want the margins to be so that, when you open up the spine of the book, you can actually read, without it being cut off. So that's a bit trickier, but it is a way to go. There are some publishing houses or literary agents that will consider works that have already been self-published, but a lot will say they are not open to it. So it's really, again, about knowing your homework, doing your homework and knowing what you need to do. So what I continued to do after I made that list of the literary agents was I had a column for when I first looked at their website, and then listed the website, wrote down notes if there was a particular agent that seemed to say that they're looking for some unique memoir about an unusual athletic experience. If there's something that sounds like, oh, that's exactly what my project's about, then I wrote down the note that I should contact that particular agent in the agency. Then I wrote down the contact email. I wrote down what needs to be submitted, whether it's just the query letter, whether it's the query letter and, the first 10 pages or chapter or whatever. I wrote down when I submitted it to them, what date. And I did do all of these electronically because obviously it saves a lot of money from printing out all of these sample materials. If you do submit it to them in hard copy, usually if you want a response back, you need to include an SASE, which is a self-addressed stamped envelope. And so put your address on it and a stamp so that all they have to do is just print out the letter, stuff it in that envelope, and put it in the mail. And so, like I said, I did mine electronically, but you can do yours in hard copy. So I would write down when I sent it out, if and when I received a reply, or if and when they suggested that I follow up. Because if you're submitting to multiple agents, which you probably will need to, especially if you have yet to be published, then you're going to want to keep track of that. And so if it was a no, I would put an X next to their name so that I know that avenue is kind of a dead end. And I could keep track of everything. So I've found that immeasurably helpful because it kept me organized. It lets me know, where I'm at. And I would strongly suggest that you do the same. So, like I said before, there are a lot of different, I wouldn't say rules, but there are a lot of different structures depending on what kind of book you're writing. I am a huge reader, and so I think that helps when I'm trying to do my creative writing because you know what it should look like. Does that mean that you're actually going to achieve that? Not necessarily, but you at least are more familiar with the work that you're trying to create. So the last thing that I wanted to just touch upon is the fact that a lot of literary agents and or publishers nowadays want to represent someone who has a good, what they call, social media platform. So they want to know that if and when they publish your book, that you're going to do some of the promotion yourself, that you have an already established audience that will almost guarantee sales. Obviously, that's a little difficult to establish if you have yet to write anything and you're not a celebrity or a politician. So it really is about getting on social media, being present, getting your content and your message out there. A blog always is helpful because it gets your writing style out there. It lets readers get more interested in your work. And having social media accounts, I'm sorry to say for the older generation, it is kind of a requirement at this point because if you don't exist in the social media universe, then they're probably not going to want to take a chance on you because it's really difficult. Nowadays, there aren't a lot of bookstores that are actually out there. There are less and less of them. They're all seeming to close down because of how many ebooks that are available. So because of that, there are less book signings, there are less events that you can go to and kind of try and panhandle your books, pawn off your books. Because of that, it's really more about the digital age. And so these agencies and publishing houses are really looking for you to do some of the work that maybe they used to handle. So I would suggest making contacts, keeping a good LinkedIn page, keeping an active blog that kind of submits your message, not necessarily writing about everything that your book is about, because then why would the readers want to purchase a book that they've essentially already read online? But staying kind of on brand, if you were, in a marketing sense. I know for me, I had to self-promote and self-market while I had my own law firm. And I ran a blog and was very, very visible on Facebook with a ton of different news stories on different crimes that were happening. And I know it got nauseating to a lot of my friends and family because it was kind of in your face. But in terms of marketing, like they say about commercials, it's really not about whether the person likes the commercial, it's whether they remember it and remember who it's for. So sometimes being out there is enough to stay present in people's minds, to think, oh, I know that author, I know that person, I know that blogger, so that they might want to be interested in reading your book. And hopefully, in the end, word of mouth will spread about your piece, and you can get more of a social media platform through that. But in terms of trying to get your name out there, it's pretty difficult. So these are all the things that I have learned thus far. Also, perhaps trying to make connections within that genre. There are a lot of different writing organizations, depending on what genre you're in. Romance writers or science fiction writers associations. There are a lot of writing contests that you can submit to, and I would suggest perhaps doing that so that you're more noticed by your writing community, by your colleagues. That can be helpful. So it's really about having a thick skin and persistence and not letting rejection or a negative critique or negative feedback stop you. So if this is something that you're very passionate about doing, do it. For me personally, writing my memoir was completely cathartic. It really helped me get, not entirely through, but get through a lot of the pain and anger that I was feeling about becoming disabled and having a once very athletic and active body become almost unusable. So throughout the process of writing the lessons that I'd learned, it actually reinforced those lessons. And so I'm really thankful for doing it. Not even if it ever gets published. I really hope that it does, because I do hope, especially for this disabled community, that it could help some people not only feel that they're not alone, but maybe forgive themselves for neglecting their health or motivating them to stay better on top of their health. But even if it isn't, I do feel like this past year of writing it and submitting it for potential publication has helped me. And it's given me a little bit of peace that I was really lacking at this time of transition. And I am so thankful that I did write it. Again, like James Patterson said, he never got his first work published. And there are a lot of other authors out there, very well-known authors, who will tell you that it takes a lot of effort and a lot of perseverance to be a published author, to be a known author. But I say, even if you're not published, even if all you do is self-publish, which is not to knock self-publishing in any way, if you feel like you need to write. Especially with the format of blogging, where it can be accessible to anyone with just the click of a button. I really do feel that it is a beautiful art form, and I encourage each and every one of you who has those aspirations to pursue them. And if you have any questions, again, not that I'm a master in this, but if you do, then I encourage you to reach out to me. My website is hearmeroarpodcast.com. You can also go to katherineitacy.com, which is KatherineItacy.com. You can find me on Twitter at Katherine_Itacy. You can find me on Instagram, Katherine.Itacy. You can find me on Tumblr, Google+, Facebook. You should be able to now subscribe to this new podcast on Google Play and iTunes. The previous podcast was Hammer Time with Nikki and Kate, which is still available on those platforms. I'm also on YouTube. So if you have any questions, any kind of feedback or requests for future episodes, please feel free to contact me in any of those mediums. And I wish all of you the best of luck in your endeavors in creative writing, if that's what you so choose to do, and any other kind of artistic expression that you feel speaks to your soul. And I'm excited for the coming year, for everyone's future, and for this podcast. So if you guys, again, have any feedback or suggestions or comments for this episode or for any future episodes, I'd love to hear them. I always do. And I wish you all a happy 2019, and I will be seeing you guys soon. Thanks so much.